Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be taking you to the haunted woods for a truly chilling collection of scary stories. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened to me back in high school of around 2005, and even now years later, just thinking about it sends chills racing down my spine. I still can't explain what we saw that night, and I'm sharing it here hoping someone has encountered something similar or knows what it could have been. It was a Sunday night after church, and my friends and I were driving my cousin back to his place before heading to a local restaurant to meet up with some other friends for a late bite. My cousin lived deep in the Ozarks of Missouri, way out in the woods, about 6 to 8 miles down this extremely secluded gravel road that twisted through dense forest and felt like it led to the edge of nowhere. Fall had stripped all the trees bare, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, and it was a new moon, plunging everything into inky, oppressive darkness. A darkness so profound it barely pierced more than a few dozen yards ahead. We dropped my cousin off without incident. There were no lights on at his isolated cabin, and we pulled away and started making our way back out of those enveloping woods towards the main country road that would finally spit us out towards civilization and town. About halfway down that lonely stretch, we rounded a sharp curve and began climbing a gentle uphill rise, the crest maybe 60 yards ahead, silhouetted faintly against the black tree line. That's when our headlights caught it. What looked like a single deer standing stock still right in the middle of the road, at the hill's top, broadside to us, unmoving, and blocking the path. Living in rural Missouri, deer on the roads weren't exactly shocking. Collisions happened all the time, so I didn't panic or slam on the brakes. I figured it'd bolt into the brush as we closed in, like they always did. I kept a steady pace, chatting idly with my friend about dinner plans. But as we halved the distance covered in those first 30 yards or so, details sharpened in the beams, and then it hit me like ice water. This was no deer. The shape solidified into something utterly alien, a compact-looking ball of dense, swirling fog or mist, roughly about the same size of a large buck, maybe 3 to 4 feet across at its widest. It didn't touch the gravel, it hovered silently about a meter above the road surface, perfectly stationary, no sway or drift from any breeze. The edges held sharp definition despite their translucency, like condensed vapor packed tight, glowing faintly where our lights hit, refracting oddly without dispersing. My brain short-circuited for a split second. Smudge on the windshield? Grime from bugs or dust? I swiped my hands across the glass hard, clearing a wide streak, but the thing stayed planted, dead center on the road ahead. We crept closer, maybe 20 yards now, headlights bathing it fully in harsh, white glare. This was no illusion. The mist ball pulsed subtly, almost breathing. Then, with deliberate slowness, began rising straight up off the road. It ascended smoothly to about 20 feet in the air, hanging there suspended for one endless moment, silhouetted against the starry void above the hill crest. Then rocketed away, shooting fast and linear into the dark wood to our right, vanishing mid-flight, like a snuffed flare, leaving absolute darkness in its wake. I stomped the brakes, tires skidding faintly on the loose gravel, and we sat there, engine idling, staring at the empty crest in stunned silence. 5 full minutes ticked by, hearts pounding, and neither of us daring to speak first. And the forest pressing in around us now felt watchful. Finally, we rolled on towards the country road, tension thick as the fog itself. My friend, who's a clean-cut guy, who never curses, shattered the first word. What the hell was that? We still bring it up sometimes. in an attempt to dissect it from every angle, but nothing ever fits. Don't think it was swamp gas, headlight refraction off ground mist, optical glitch from dirty glass or tired eyes, but no explanation holds up. The rise, the pause, the bolt away, that was too controlled and responsive. That road's haunted my drives ever since. I flat out refuse to take it at night even years later. Has anyone seen a hovering mist orb thing like that in the Ozarks elsewhere? I really need to know what that was. When I was around 7 years old, my family lived in a cozy house in Webster, Wisconsin, which was noticeably wider and longer than a typical trailer home, featuring only a single base floor along with a basement below, and surrounded by a vast expanse of beautiful woods that stretched out endlessly behind it. One sunny day, my cousin Scotty was tasked with watching my 2 younger sisters and me, and he casually announced that we could all head outside to play, as long as we stayed firmly within his line of sight from the yard. Within just 5 minutes of us stepping out, he suddenly bolted into the dense forest ahead of us and shouted for us to keep up with him. So of course we listened eagerly and took off running right after him through the trees. He vanished completely almost immediately, leaving us unable to see either the house or even the familiar tree line where the woods ended. And before long, we realized with growing panic that we were utterly lost inside the forest. We started freaking out and crying hysterically. As the reality sank in, our small voices echoing uselessly off the trunks, while the fear gripped tighter. It wasn't until about 1 hour later when a really tall Native American chief, dressed in traditional attire, emerged quietly from behind us and asked gently what was wrong, and why we were crying, and if we were okay, and whether we were lost in the woods. I explained through my sobs how we had been chasing after my cousin who led us here and then vanished, leaving us with no idea whatsoever how to find our way back home. He smiled reassuringly and said not to worry at all, because he would personally make sure we got home safe and sound if we just followed him back to his nearby village for a short rest, some lunch made by his people, and a chance to play briefly with the children there before explaining exactly where we lived. I nodded through my tears, so we trailed behind this kind towering figure as he led us deeper into the woods, until we reached his village situated in a small clearing. The village was modest, but a vibrant settlement right in the heart of the forest, with at least 60 people as far as I can see. They were cooking over open fires and tending to simple structures made of wood and hide, where they gave us a hearty stew. The chief had me draw a rough map in the dirt using a stick, sketching out the road leading us to our house, so he could understand precisely where we needed to go. And upon seeing it, he smiled confidently and said he knew exactly where to go and that we were welcome to play with the children for a little longer if we wanted. But he insisted on getting us home well before dark fell, because the woods held many dangers like bears, coyotes, and bobcats that posed serious threats to young children wandering alone after sunset. True to his word, he guided us safely all the way back to the edge of our property, where the tree line met the yard, and he stopped right there without stepping fully into the open, while my mum came rushing out of the house in tears, frantically asking where on earth we had been, since she was about to call the police, as we had been missing for 5 hours. She demanded to know why we had left the house without Scotty staying right with us as instructed, and I insisted that he absolutely had been with us because he ran ahead into the woods calling for us to follow before vanishing completely, leaving us trying desperately to call out to find him, before finding him gone without a trace. Right then, Scotty himself came sauntering outside and claimed he had never once left the house at all, insisting he thought we were playing in our rooms the whole time. I told my mum the full story of chasing him and then meeting the chief who brought us back, but she told me we would figure everything out properly come tomorrow, after everyone calmed down. The very next day, we retraced our exact path by following the clear footprints we had left in the softer ground, and arrived back at what should have been the chief's village, in the same clearing in the woods. To our complete horror, almost nothing remained of the place that had seemed so gorgeous and alive the day before, now reduced to scattered ash and charred remnants as if a massive fire had swept through long ago, with the grass that had stood short around the structures now growing wildly taller than I ever was and appearing thoroughly burnt over in a way that suggested hundreds of years of abandonment and neglect. We called out repeatedly for the chief and all the people, hoping someone might respond, but we were met only with eerie silence. As we prepared to head back towards home with heavy hearts, I spotted one final item half buried near the edge of the clearing. A huge eagle feather measuring the full size of my outstretched arm. That remains the most amazing and undeniable paranormal experience I have ever had in my entire life, leaving me forever changed by the mystery of how an entire village, complete with kind strangers, could vanish into ancient ruins overnight, in a place we had physically walked to and from. This is a true story my grandmother experienced long before she and my mother moved away from their home village. She lived there most of her life, and while she never claimed to believe in the paranormal, strange things seemed to follow her in that place. This was only one of several unsettling experiences she had, but it was the one that stayed with her until the day she died. My grandmother lived in a small, rural village surrounded by fields. She worked as the village postwoman, a job that required her to travel long distances every day to deliver mail to people who lived far from the village centre. Many of those homes were isolated and tucked between tree lines or hidden at the edge of the woods, places where roads slowly dissolved into dirt paths. Her job also meant she had to spend a lot of time talking to elderly villagers while handing over letters or parcels. She often listened to the old stories and local legends, stories about parts of the forest that people avoided and places where even animals refused to go. Well, during spring, summer, and early autumn, she rode her bicycle. But when winter came or the roads turned to thick mud, she traveled by horse and wagon. This happened during late autumn, because on that day, she took the horse. Some of the people she had to visit lived so far out that the shortest route to reach them required cutting straight through a forest. It was an old, dense, and uneven one, with trees growing very close together, and in some places, daylight barely reached the ground. She obviously had passed through it many times before without incident, but on that day on her way back, she decided to take a slightly different path, one that she had long suspected would save time, and with just enough time to spare, she decided to try it. And that's when things began to feel wrong. At first, she didn't panic. She noticed she was seeing the same cluster of crooked trees again, and then the same fallen log. Then the same narrow clearing where the snow looked oddly untouched. And no matter which way she turned, it almost seemed like the forest was rearranging itself, leading her back to the same place over and over. As time passed, she didn't hear any birds or wind, and even the horse grew restless, snorting and stamping its hooves as if it sensed something she could not. The light dimmed faster than she thought it should have, and it almost appeared like the forest was closing in around them. That's when she remembered a story one of the old villagers told her, that long ago there had been a grand mansion deep within the woods, and during a wedding feast, the ground beneath it suddenly gave way, and the entire house sank into the earth in an instant. Bride, groom, guests, music, everyone gone. Only the priest survived, able to share the story. Over the years, the forest swallowed the ruins, growing over the site as if trying to hide it. But since then, the forest has never been quite the same. People said anyone who wandered too close to the cursed ground would lose their sense of direction and the path would loop endlessly. Standing there exhausted, my grandmother realized she must have entered the very place they spoke of. She tried everything, turning the wagon around, choosing a new path, retracing her steps, but nothing seemed to work. She appeared to be in there for hours. By then her hands were numb from the cold, and fear had begun to creep in earnest. As dusk fell, the woods grew darker than the night should be, and she felt a growing certainty that if she stayed much longer, she may well never leave. Finally, completely drained, she stopped fighting. She spoke softly to her horse, an animal that she trusted deeply, and did the only thing left to do. She loosened the reins and told him to take her home. Then she let go entirely, giving the horse full control. Almost immediately, the animal moved. The path he chose felt different, and the forest slowly began to thin, shadows retreating as if letting her go reluctantly. She didn't interfere or guide him in any way. She simply held on. When they finally emerged from the woods, it was full night. Lights were already on in the village, and people were beginning to worry. What should have been a short route had taken her somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. To this day, no one can explain what happened. She had lived in that village her entire life and knew the roads, the fields, and those forests better than most. Yet somehow in those woods, she had been turned around, held there, and only released when putting her faith in her animal companion. And as you no doubt have guessed, she never entered those parts of the woods again. This happened about 2 years ago, sometime in late June or early July, in a rural area near the western border of Poland near Germany. If you can picture dense forest and rolling hills, that's pretty much what it looked like. So I got a call from my Aunt Magda asking if I could come meet her at the small tobacco kiosk where she worked. Her voice sounded rushed and tight, and I already knew something was wrong. I agreed, and within 30 minutes, I was there. When I arrived, Magda barely greeted me before asking if I could stay and watch the kiosk for a bit. She informed me that she had to leave immediately to get her boyfriend Daniel and his friends. When I asked why, she hesitated for a moment, then explained what she knew. Just before calling me, Daniel had phoned her in a panic. He and 2 of his friends, Philippe and Jacob, had gone on a short trip into the countryside. They'd brought air guns, just the kind that you'd use for casual target practice, nothing serious. For fun, they decided they'd drive up a hill to where an old World War II era bunker stood, half forgotten and swallowed by the forest. That area was dotted with abandoned dirt roads and concrete ruins left over from border defenses from decades ago. The bunker itself was tiny, barely big enough for 2 people. One single concrete room with a narrow opening facing each direction. According to locals, no one really used that spot anymore. The woods around it were thick and always very quiet, and known for making people uncomfortable. Magda told me that it was all Daniel had managed to say before begging her to come get them. He claimed they couldn't leave. All 3 of them were terrified beyond reason. So I stayed behind at the shop while she rushed off. Less than 10 minutes later, Magda returned with them. That alone was strange. They had been really close. When the car stopped, Daniel didn't even turn the engine off at first. Philippe and Jacob got out slowly. They were pale, not just shaken but white. Their faces looked drained, their eyes unfocused, and none of them spoke. Daniel sat down on the bench outside the shop and stared at the ground like he was too scared to look anywhere else. I waited, and finally, Daniel started talking. He went on to tell me that when they first arrived at the bunker, everything felt normal. They parked the car about 10 meters away on the dirt clearing, got out, laughed, loaded their air guns, and all was fine. Bear in mind, there are no houses nearby or any people. You could only see forest on all sides. They climbed onto the bunker roof, about 1.5 meters in height, and spent some time shooting rocks and old cans, the woods absorbing the sound strangely. When they finished and climbed down, Daniel was the first one to notice that something was amiss. The car was still there exactly where they'd left it, but when he got closer, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. Old, dirty bricks, some cracked, others covered in moss, had been stacked tightly around every single wheel, perfectly built up from the ground to the chassis like small walls. 4 separate barriers, as if someone had taken time to construct them while the 3 of them were standing on the bunker roof. There was no way they could have missed those bricks when they arrived. The clearing had been empty, flat dirt and weeds with nothing else. In their fear they ran. All 3 of them jumped into the car and slammed the door shut. The engine started, but the car wouldn't move, not an inch, like the wheels were cemented in place. Jacob bolted out the car and began kicking the brick walls apart, shouting like he was suffocating. The bricks crumbled easily in his hand. After a minute, he was convinced it was enough and jumped back in. But this time the car wouldn't even start. That's when Philippe called a friend from a nearby town, begging him to tow them out. The friends agreed. For about 10 minutes they sat in silence, windows up, eyes glued to the tree line, when the phone rang again. The friend said he was on the road at the bottom of the hill, and he could see them. Their car was visible through a break in the trees, but no matter what he did, he couldn't find the road leading up, like the path had vanished. And suddenly he started screaming. He yelled that something had come out of the woods near their car, that it was running straight for them. He was begging for them to leave, shouting incoherently. But the scariest part was that none of them saw anything. They were staring directly at the forest, but nothing moved. The call ended abruptly, and the friend never called back. They sat there hysterically shouting at each other, until finally they forced themselves to be quiet and listen. And that's the moment when they heard one sharp knock on the car window. It came from the right side, directly facing the forest. And that was when Daniel called Magda. When he finished telling us, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. But the strangest part wasn't him. More that Philippe and Jacob didn't say a single word. And according to Magda, they were distant for weeks afterwards, withdrawn and easily startled. No one ever talks about that day anymore, but I think about it constantly. To my knowledge, those bricks are still there. I grew up in and around the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, spending so much time out there that I'd seen and heard tons of weird stuff over the years. Things that make the hair on your neck stand up if you're not used to how the woods work. Most of it has a straightforward explanation once you think it through. Animals scavenging, weather warping sounds, shadows playing tricks in the mist or low light. But some stick with you because they feel off in a way that is simply too hard to shake off. Let's take one time in early April, when I was walking down a familiar dirt back road that cuts through thick pines and lingering snowbanks. Right there in the middle of the tracks sat a coyote skull, perfectly centered, like it had been arranged on purpose, just waiting for someone to discover it. Pale bone, gleaming dully against the mud. The rest of the body was long gone, mostly stripped clean by birds and other smaller scavengers, with just scraps of dried fur and sinew hanging off the edges. But the eyes were still intact, cloudy and shriveled, yet staring up with this glassy, unblinking intensity that hit me like a punch. I'll never forget those eyes. They looked unnaturally fresh against the picked-over bone, almost accusatory. It was prime snow melt season, so my best guess was the coyote got trapped deep in a drift sometime in that brutal winter, starved or froze solid, and as soon as the thaw loosened everything up, opportunistic animals like foxes, ravens, or even bears decapitated it, battered the head around, and dumped it smack in the road for me to stumble over. Grim as hell, but classic nature cycle. I towed some dirt over it with my boot and moved on, though that stare haunted me for weeks afterwards. Since you're probably digging for something more paranormal than roadside roadkill, I've only really had one experience out in those woods that I truly can't explain or rationalize away, no matter how many angles I try. It went down when I was 17, during early spring, that miserable in-between season when the snowpack is half-rotted and treacherous, collapsing into slushy holes one step at a time, and the absolute fewest hikers venture out because it's sloppy, cold, and really pointless unless you live nearby and know the terrain. I was cooped up, antsy, and needed to burn off some steam, so I drove out to this seldom-used trail, threading over the overgrown ruins of an old abandoned settlement, buried deep in the forest. It's not on any tourist map or app, just a faint, eroded path that locals know about and is barely visible unless you're looking for it. Snaking past crumbling dry stone walls from the 1800s, choked up cellar holes swallowed by ferns and moss. You get the idea. Even in full summertime, when families crowd the groomed trails with their cooler kids, this one's rarely touched. But enough about the trail. You get the idea. So I parked my beat-up old car in the narrow dirt pull-off near the trailhead. The only vehicle for miles in any direction, locked it tight, slung a water bottle over my shoulder, and plunged in on foot. My boots punched through crusty surface snow, into the softer, sucking slush below, each step an intentional wade to avoid twisting an ankle or hidden rocks or roots. The forest wrapped around me in that signature early spring hush, sounds muffled and swallowed by the damp air and snow cover. There was no real wind to rattle the trunks, no sporadic heavy plops of melting clumps sliding off overhanging limbs, and the steady squeak-squelch of my own progress echoing faintly. Visibility stretched decently through the thinning hardwood, but snowdrifts and tangled underbrush hemmed everything in, making the world feel smaller. I pushed maybe half a mile uphill, skirting a vine-choked foundation that might have been a barn once, when the humming first cut through. It registered faint at first, a delicate thread of sound laced off to my right, maybe 20 to 30 yards into the thicker wood, deep enough amid trunks and brush that a direct line of sight should have been blocked, especially with the slope and patchy whiteout. Not a buzz or trill like machinery or birdsong. It was unmistakably human. I pinned it immediately as a woman's voice, smooth, mid-range tone, feminine lilt with that natural quiver. No discernible lyrics or rhythm I recognized, just this persistent, melodic drone slicing the stillness. I halted dead, boots sinking slightly as my ears perked up. There were no other vehicles at the pull-off. No crisscrossing tracks marring into the trail's fresh snow. This path might see 4 or 5 souls all year tops, and in slop season, statistically nearly 0. Who the hell would be crashing around here humming like that, positioned just hidden enough to stay unseen, but yet near enough for me to hear them really well? I swept the tree line slowly, breath clouding thick in the biting air, spotting only snow-draped branches nodding faintly in a uniform grey sky leaching through the canopy. It was then that my rational brain kicked in, meltwater channeling under the pack, gurgling resonant against submerged rocks or roots somewhere nearby, happens plenty that in thaw, it's nature's hidden symphony. Or maybe a steady breeze, threading a hollow trunk just right so that it vibrates like a flute. The woods can be full of auditory ghosts. I shook it off and resumed, pace cautious now, senses dialed to 11. The humming resumed instantly, shadowing my steps. The volume was creeping up subtly as the trail climbed. So I tested it deliberately. I planted my feet firm. The sound snuffed out crisp mid-note, plunging back into the drip-drip quiet. I counted to 30, ears ringing in the silence, and then I pushed on. And the moment I did, it fired up again, bolder, threading nearer, sinking flawlessly through the trees. Every halt cut off, whereas every stride forward, the swelling insistence, that woman's hum dogging parallel like a shadow. No prankster could have threaded that dense tangle undetected. There were no audible snaps, no churned snow, no boot prints leading onto the path. And why target a ghost trail midweek in muck? Dread bloomed low and cold in my gut, primal vice clamping tight, and every neck hair prickling electric. I felt pursued. I whipped around sharp, downhill back to the car. That half mile suddenly feeling endless. My legs churned through the treacherous slush, crust exploding under boots, soft sinks dragging like tar. My lungs clawed fire in the chill, exhalations blasting. My arms were flailing wildly for balance on the lumpy grade. Then came the parallel pursuit, a crashing cadence ripping right alongside me through the dense understory, matching my frenzy beat for beat, like some relentless metronome diving the terror deep. The rhythm felt distinct, nothing like a mere echo of my own panicked steps. Instead, I heard a muffled thwomp as snow compacted under heavy weight, brittle twigs popped and snapping beneath deliberate mass that was moving parallel to me. It wasn't trailing behind or leaping ahead to cut me off. No, it locked me stride for stride exactly, staying about 10 yards in through the trees, veiled by thick boles, yet radiating menace all the same. I refused any side-along peek, certainly screaming inside that mutual gaze would shatter me completely into fragments I'd never recover from. My vision tunneled straight ahead to the trail. Finally, the path flared wide near the road, opening into the pull-off where my car waited. The sound sheared off absolutely in that moment. A vacuum of silence was all that was left. I staggered into the clearing, fingers numb, clawing desperately at keys that slipped twice before catching hold, and dove inside, slamming the door. I peeled out of there. Intellectually, I know the humming synced too surgically perfect, pace locked too flawlessly to match any coincidence or human trickery. It still chills me bone deep every time. This happened when I was 9 years old, back around the mid-2000s period, when my parents impulsively bought a derelict and long-abandoned farm nestled deep within the remote woods of rural Sweden, marking their first such ambitious super fixer-upper project since they had recently sold a previous property only after transforming it from a ruin into something livable, which left me feeling bittersweet about parting with my familiar old adventures, yet buzzing with anticipation for fresh mysteries awaiting to be discovered. The first farm had served as my absolute playground paradise, where nothing remotely spooky ever managed to touch or unsettle me in the slightest. I would wander completely alone for hours through the whispering woods that surrounding it, happily building dens, forts, and hideouts designed specifically for picnics with my imaginary adventure squad. But the moment we acquired the second farm, something was different. I don't know if it was the sagging main house adorned with peeling paint and floors that groaned under every footfall, or the dusty garage overflowing with rusted tools and forgotten machinery, a cavernous stable permeated by the lingering scent of damp hay, and long dead livestock, and a mysterious fourth building which stood half collapsed and charred black from some devastating long ago fire. Its purpose had been vanished to the mists of time and decay. Early visits to the property revolved entirely around grueling work sessions like painting walls, hammering nails into sagging beams, and scrubbing away layers of stubborn mold from every surface, while I busied myself poking around the various outbuildings and the encircling pines, kicking through thick layers of leaf litter and peering cautiously into every shadowed corner that caught my curiosity. Being utterly obsessed with horses at that age, I claimed the stable as my personal domain immediately. We had owned and been working on the place for roughly a full year before the first genuinely terrifying incident struck without warning. I found myself completely alone inside the stable one afternoon, wading knee-deep through scattered piles of hay, while stacking it meticulously into makeshift stalls for my imaginary herd of ponies, when suddenly, a pair of invisible hands clamped vice-like around my slender neck, with cold, iron-tight fingers that squeezed my throat using deliberate and unrelenting force. All breath vanished instantly from my lungs as my windpipe compressed under the assault, leaving me burning inside with silent panic, while my small body thrashed desperately in a futile bid for air. No sound could escape my constricted throat beyond a strangled wheeze as I bolted blindly out through the wide stable doors towards the open ground. The moment I burst into the blinding sunlight and spotted my mum standing nearby across the yard, the merciless grip released all at once. I collapsed right there in a heap, coughing and wheezing violently, with my throat transformed into raw, searing fire while gasping for ragged breaths. Words choked out painfully between convulsive hacks as I desperately tried to explain the sensation of those choking hands. But the excruciating pain silenced any coherent attempt while I kept coughing uncontrollably. Mum hustled me straight inside the main house without hesitation, shoving a glass of cool water into my trembling hands. Yet, even after 15 solid minutes of relentless hacking and gasping for air, she decided it was serious enough to bundle me into the car for an urgent trip to the nearest hospital, while Dad stayed behind watching over my brothers. The coughing faded eventually as we drove, leaving doctors completely baffled since they found no signs of infection, injury, or swelling, just a vague diagnosis of a sudden asthma attack that made no sense. Complete BS in retrospect, especially since I'd experienced zero allergies whatsoever until the age of 14 and didn't suffer my actual first asthma attack until I turned 13. This felt profoundly external, malicious, and specifically targeted at me. From that day forward, I ditched the stable completely and forever, opting instead for safer romps and games deep in the woods alongside my brothers. Exactly 2 years later, at the age of 11, a set of heavy footsteps echoed through the floorboards, yanked me awake from sleep in the middle of the night. I slid silently from my bed and padded barefoot past my soundly sleeping parents, who shared the same cramped room with me. Continued on into the dim kitchen, illuminated solely by faint slivers of moonlight filtering through its grimy, frosted-rimmed windows. Right there in the center stood a tall, pitch-black humanoid figure, resembling a void carved from the surrounding shadows, its edges blurring softly into the darkness while exuding an unmistakable presence. It loomed close enough that I could have brushed against it if I'd veered even slightly to the left, yet passing my dad's familiar snoring form on the way grounded the entire scene firmly as real rather than some fleeting dream or hallucination. I froze solid mid-step, with my skin crawling ferociously under the weight of its unseen gaze. until some inexplicable inner force shoved me backwards, compelling me to turn sharply around and march straight back to bed without daring a single glance back. Sleep completely evaded me for the remainder of that endless night, as prickling invisible eyes bored relentlessly into me from the enveloping dark, radiating hot waves of unmistakable hostility. I told my parents all about seeing the man in the kitchen first thing in the morning, but they dismissed it casually as nothing more than my sleepy imagination running wild. Perhaps I was dreaming after all, or so I tried telling myself repeatedly. But from the moment that figure appeared, the entire farm soured irreversibly in my perception, bringing a constant unwelcome chill that seeped into every corner, along with the unmistakable sensation of eyes tracking my every movement, as if the farm itself hated my presence and regarded me eternally as nothing but an unwelcome intruder violating its territory. The absolute worst incident arrived when I turned 13, finding me glued to my clunky old dial-up computer inside the main house while multitasking frantic online chats with faraway friends. My headset half on, blasting tiny electro music in one ear. My parents suddenly announced they needed to head out on a grocery run that would take them miles away over winding dirt roads for a solid trip of several hours, pausing to ask directly if I wanted to tag along, despite my obvious distraction. Deeply immersed in the heat of an intense raid sequence, I waved them off absent-mindedly with a casual, "Nah, I'm good here." They double-checked one final time to make absolutely certain, and when I nodded firmly without looking up, the front door slammed shut behind them, following immediately by the crunch of gravel under tire as their car faded slowly down the long dirt driveway. Instant regret crashed over me like a tsunami. The solitude enveloped the house. Pure, irrational, yet viscerally overwhelming terror flooded every cell, causing the room to shrink claustrophobically, while shadows deepened menacingly in every corner as I scanned frantically for some lurking wrongness that instinct screamed was present. The distant hum of their departing car finally died away, leaving me behind in that oppressive silence. Then the taps began without mercy. A single deliberate tap echoed first. A measured pause followed, then two more in quick succession. The taps unfolded in a rhythmic, utterly predictable metronome pattern emanating from somewhere indistinct. Perhaps the walls vibrating subtly, the floorboards creaking under invisible weight, or even the ceiling overhead sagging with unseen pressure. I didn't know from where. I knew full well they faced at least a solid 2 hours minimum before coming home again, given how far away the nearest grocery store was. I had no choice but to tough it out alone in that mounting horror. But suddenly the kitchen doorway loomed ominously before me, revealing a black figure stalking forwards with deliberate predatory intent directly towards where I stood frozen. This time no shred of doubt clouded my mind that it was anything resembling a dream. My lungs compressed under a crushing vice-like grip, while a brutal headache exploded viciously behind my eyes. We locked in stares for 5 endless heart-stopping seconds before raw shock finally shattered my paralysis into motion. I sprinted straight for the back door with flip-flops slapping wildly against my heels from earlier breakfast eaten outside, which turned out to be a pure stroke of luck, preserving my feet. I tore up the dusty dirt road, desperately aiming to reach the nearest neighbor who lived a full 20-minute hike further along. Completely unexpected relief appeared when our family car suddenly crested the far rise, barreling back towards me as soon as possible. I veered immediately to the roadside as my parents leaped out of the vehicle looking alarmed by my wild appearance, and I burst into uncontrollable sobbing while blurting out the incoherent details of the choking figure, relentless taps, and overwhelming terror that had driven me out. They bundled me straight into the car without another word, while I flatly refused any possibility of re-entering that house ever again under any circumstance. My parents chalked the entire ordeal up to mere paranoia or hallucination at first, later accusing me outright of exaggerating wildly for attention. I have always stood firmly by exactly what my eyes witnessed, that figure stalking me without mercy. Years later, as an adult, I visited the farm precisely once more, but fled immediately, overwhelmed by nausea and dread. Whatever malevolent presence haunted that farm despised me specifically, with a deep personal grudge seeping from every shadowed corner and creaking floorboard. One nagging horror still torments me deeply to this day: the impossible timeline warp surrounding that final encounter. The full grocery trek reliably took hours upon hours over those remote roads, yet everything from their departure until their car returned felt like a mere span of 5 to 10 frantic minutes. Time slippage or something far worse? Honestly, I don't know, and I'm grateful beyond words that I never have to set foot back in there again for the rest of my natural-born life. Deep in Transylvania, just outside a large university city, there is a forest that locals have avoided for generations. Official maps give it an orderly name, but among the people who live nearby, it's simply known as the Bad Forest. Long before tourists or paranormal investigators ever showed up, villagers warned their children never to wander inside. Shepherds wouldn't graze their animals near it, and woodcutters only entered in groups, and never after sunset. Or at least, that's the stories that I was told. And the reason is because everyone who steps beneath its twisted canopy reports something going wrong. From the very first steps inside, people describe sudden nausea, crushing anxiety, dizziness, pounding headaches that come out of nowhere. Some people say they vomited without warning. Others say their skin burned or blistered as if exposed to heat or chemicals when nothing had touched them. The most common feeling, though, is harder to explain. A deep primal sense that you are unwelcome, like you've crossed into a place where humans do not belong. And because of these stories, a biologist in the mid-20th century decided to investigate. He spent years walking the forest alone, documenting strange plant growth, trees, and areas where instruments refused to behave normally. Over time, he reported the constant sensation of being accompanied. He'd mention of shadows that were always out of his field of vision. Sometimes those shadows took clearer forms. He described seeing what looked like a man and woman standing among the trees. The moment he tried to approach or acknowledge them, they would fade out. On one occasion, he managed to photograph one of these figures mid-disappearance. The image reportedly showed a human shape with missing or malformed limbs. Most of his research never survived. After his death, much of his documentation was stolen or destroyed. Decades later, a psychological professor took up the work, but unlike his predecessor, he focused heavily on photographic and video evidence, and over the years he collected images of glowing orbs, strange beams of light, and mist-like shapes. What made his work especially unsettling was his claim that the forest reacts differently depending on who enters it. Skeptics often report nothing more than discomfort, while people who already believe in the paranormal tend to experience far more intense phenomena. One of the most infamous incidents occurred late in the 1960s. A military technician, ignoring local warnings, went into the forest with his girlfriend and a couple of friends, hoping to relax to escape city life. While gathering firewood near a clearing in the early afternoon, he heard his friends shouting his name, and when he returned to them, they were all staring upwards. Hovering silently above the treetops was a strange, disc-shaped metallic object that was completely soundless. It moved slowly, then began to glow, shifting positions in a way that didn't resemble any known aircraft. The man managed to take several photographs before it vanished. Those images later became some of the clearest UFO photographs ever taken in the region, and are still debated to this day. But UFO sightings are only part of what makes this forest terrifying. People who enter often report the overwhelming feeling of being watched, not casually observed, but studied. Many describe the sensation that the forest itself is alive and aware, and that they are intruders in something hostile. At night, the feeling allegedly intensifies. Apparitions are common. Strange structures and shapes appear between the trees. Many of them can't be seen with the naked eye, but show up clearly in photographs. Instruments detect intense magnetic anomalies, sudden electromagnetic fluctuations, and infrasound emissions known to cause fear, paranoia, and hallucinations in humans. There are also reports of marks appearing on the ground in real time, burnt patches in grass, strange impressions in soil or snow forming right in front of witnesses. Plants in certain areas show signs of damage that can't be explained naturally. Scorched leaves, necrotic stems, and sudden dehydration as if something had drained the life from them. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from photographs taken by tourists. Many people only realize something was wrong after they developed their photos. Faces, dozens, sometimes hundreds, can be seen hidden among the trees, staring directly at the camera. Some appear human, others look distorted, stretched, or frozen in expressions of pain or anger. In a few cases, people recognized faces resembling deceased relatives or historical figures, despite no one else being present at the time. In the early 1990s, researchers identified a specific clearing inside the forest, labeling it the most active zone. Instruments spike wildly there, and paranormal reports cluster around it. Locals refuse to cross it, claiming animals won't enter, and that it feels unnatural in there. Parapsychologists studying the area agree on several points. The phenomena are subtle but constant, more suited to long-term research than the casual ghost hunt. The evidence is difficult to dismiss even for hardened skeptics, and there appears to be a strong connection between sensitive individuals and the intensity of manifestations. Some believe the forest is an interdimensional gateway, where spirits both living and dead can slip between worlds. The forest name itself comes from an old legend about a shepherd who entered with 200 sheep, and neither he or his flock were ever seen again. Some people have reportedly tried to open portals there on purpose, but most of those stories end abruptly. If you ever decide to visit, locals strongly advise sticking to marked trails and showing respect for the land. I spoke to an older local who had grown up nearby, but he didn't like talking about the forest, but when he did, he said that he had seen something and felt things there, and he didn't want to try and explain it. I've always believed in this kind of phenomenon. I've always felt drawn to it. Even knowing the risks, the forest fascinates yet terrifies me in equal measure. I plan to visit someday myself, though I'm not sure I'll ever find what's in there. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories, and if of course you have, I would appreciate it if you let me know down below. I love a good haunted wood story, especially the time skip one. They always really fascinate me. I only ever get those stories very rarely, and every time I read one, it's always like, blows my mind a little bit. I'd like to extend one final thank you as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen right now. Their support and contributions to help keep this channel running really go a hell of a long way. And if you'd like to be in their number and get some cool extra bonus stories tomorrow, I think we've got about 30 to 35 minutes worth of closet stories. I know, closet stories, topic we hardly ever have, but I think they're cool, and if you would like to listen to that, well, you probably can figure out what to do. But that's it from me, guys. Thank you all so much. I'll see you on Saturday. Until then, stay awesome and good night.